9 U.S. Presidents Assassinated by Globalists by Larry Engel. And this is article number 6 about the assassination of Zachary Taylor by Skull and Bones. This article is about the assassination of United States President Zachary Taylor, the 12th President of the United States. He was in office in 1849 and 1850. He was poisoned. Taylor died July 9, 1850, only 16 months after his inauguration. His was the third shortest tenure of any president. The fairy tale, or the official story as it's called, is a claim that he died of gastroenteritis. The actual cause was arsenic poison in the sugar bowl. President Taylor was succeeded by his vice president, Millard Fillmore. The Globalists had at least 3 motives to murder Taylor. 1, their man, a European banker pawn, Millard Fillmore, was sitting in the vice president chair, ready to take over. And second, tough old Rough and Ready, as Taylor was called, would have prevented the Civil War by militarily killing the secession movement with no compromise before it built up and got off the ground. The third motive, the European cabal powers were soon to put an emperor into Mexico to rule over what they called the Confederacy, formed of the southern states, the Caribbean, parts of Central and South America, and Mexico. Taylor knew the European royalty were the real enemy from his experience with the Mexican-American War. I used my observation, my intuition, and my opinion to investigate official stories of assassinations, and then compare them to the ruthless and cunning debt-based paper money loan agenda of the private banks that began with the Fondo Bank in 700 A.D. Well, my friends, you had better be careful, because the official report still claims to this day that the sudden death of the president was caused by sitting in the sun, eating cherries, and drinking milk. Please avoid these deadly activities while enjoying this video. It is strange how people believe anything that is official, as if the government is the word of God. The official story is what is politically correct to believe, and you will have lots of company when you parrot this story about. But I call it the Easter Bunny and the Tooth Fairy story. If you believe in the Easter Bunny and you believe in the Tooth Fairy, then you will probably believe the official story that is given out about the assassinations of these presidents in this series. There is a deathbed confession that states Skull and Bones poisoned President Taylor. The detailed study of other evidence supports the facts stated within this confession document. It indicates that one major player, Albert Pike, organized the Ku Klux Klan and the Knights of the Golden Circle, called the KGC, right? Knights of the Golden Circle, a secret society. The original objective of the Knights of the Golden Circle was to annex a golden circle of territories, which would include Mexico, Central America, South America, in other words, the north part of South America, and Cuba and the rest of the Caribbean, including the Confederate States, together all as slave states, but secretly, maybe not slave states, but definitely ruled by the European bloodline royalty. The deathbed confession indicates Pike was put in prison for treason, but was pardoned by 33rd degree member President Johnson, since we can test and authenticate this kind of information, the rest of the document is deemed to be reliable. The document identifies other major players as John Slidell and Judah Benjamin. Slidell's family connections to the Rothschilds are verified, and Judah Benjamin's pictures appear on Confederate dollar bills and on Confederate bonds, and there is abundant evidence he worked for the Rothschilds as an agent of the bank and then later as a Queen's counsel or Queen's lawyer in England. So he was a spy. The picture that appears is that Skull and Bones men murdered 9 U.S. presidents and many other political leaders, as well as a very large number of witnesses who inadvertently knew too much. The orders to kill come from the European royalty, banking, and corporate cartel. This cartel is almost invisible, except for information recently dug out by the American Free Press and by Daniel Estulin, thus highlighting the Bilderberg Group in very recent years. Bonesmen assassins are able to call upon the CIA, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the FBI, the Mossad, the Sayanim spies, the National Reconnaissance Office, the Mafia, and the Secret Service, and others on a need-to-know basis. The shrouded motive of the bloodline royal houses is likely an inbred, insane lust for power, the retaining of their peerage untouchable status. Peerage means they're untouchable. If they commit a crime against common people, they're not brought to court. The case is dismissed because they're members of the peerage, the royalty. Okay? The royalty can commit crimes against commoners in a long tradition. And also the other motive would be luxuries such as expensive clothes, expensive watches, expensive homes, expensive cars, and very fancy, expensive private airplanes. They feel threatened by equality that's in our Constitution. And they also feel threatened by real representative government and by the middle class. The president's own security people and their medical doctors frequently take part in these assassinations, and in turn, they themselves and any witnesses may be quietly murdered, as in the JFK assassination, where possibly hundreds of witnesses died of very mysterious circumstances. So this is something that has been researched by others, and they say it's a probability that these people who were witnesses and had something to contribute to the facts of the case died mysteriously. Unfortunately, the official story is frequently a fairy tale. If you believe in the Easter Bunny and you believe in the Tooth Fairy, then maybe you should believe in the official story, because it's such a farce. Even in this one, the president died from eating cherries and milk on a hot day. That's the official story. But people believe that. That's recognized throughout the nation. People just seem to believe that anything the government says is coming from God. But the official story, according to me, is a fairy tale. Taylor's body was exhumed 141 years later in the search for arsenic. Arsenic was found, but in the opinion of the medical examiner, not in sufficient quantity to cause his death. The test, though, is seriously questioned. It did not use samples from the root of the hairs where the arsenic forms after a time, but from the middle of the hairs. It seemed like it was a rigged test. That could happen, you know. Then there is the political can of worms open for any government bureaucrat. such as a coroner finding that there was poisoning and murder instead of the official story. Globalist-controlled press might accuse the medical examiner of being a conspiracy buff. He would be up against the official story touted by the mainstream press, and he would be made to look ridiculous. It would end his government career. So this is a real contest when you try to prove something of this sort, because they have the power to shut it down. And the press ridicules people and embarrasses them. There were numerous other choices of poison that the tests did not look for, such as rosary beads, argon, hemlock, or cyanide. My observation after several cases is that any doctor who was to defy the globalists can and will be killed. Again, there is a deathbed confession telling us that the assassination of Zachary Taylor, President of the United States, and identifying his killers as the Skull and Bones operatives out of New Orleans. Very reliable document. Morrison, a historian, believed Taylor would probably have recovered if left alone. The historian charged that Taylor's physician, assisted by a Baltimore quack, performed what could be regarded as a medical assassination. Morrison wrote, "They drugged him with Impec, IPECAC, and also they used Colabel, opium, and quinine at 40 grains a whack, and bled and blistered him too." Sadly, on July 9th, 1850, the president gave up the ghost. This was a presidential term in office that was just a few months, 16 months, which is typical of a globalist banker's cabal assassination or poisoning operation. The cause of Zachary Taylor's death has never been fully established officially. Another author in investigating this case, in 1978, Hamilton Smith based his assassination theory on the timing of when the poison was administered, the lack of confirmed cholera outbreaks, and other material. This is an important point, as the official claim of cholera morbus or gastroenteritis is highly unlikely. And so this investigation by Hamilton Smith is based upon the public records at the time. The symptoms, though, match arsenic and other substance poisoning. But there was a cholera outbreak, but it was not of any significance. And that's what the public records indicate. Taylor was aware that he had been poisoned. Newspapers at the time reported that he made this statement the day before he died: "I should not be surprised if this were to terminate in my death. I did not expect to encounter what has beset me since my elevation to the presidency. God knows I have endeavored to fulfill what I conceive to be an honest duty. But I have been mistaken. My motives have been misconstrued, and my feelings most grossly outraged." Grossly outraged means that he was mad as hell at his murderers. What Taylor meant by his honest duty was to represent the interests of the nation and the people. This put him in direct conflict with the loan, paper money, private banking cartel. This activated the Skull and Bones killers. Did the cabal-owned, controlled mass media overplay their hand and become very obvious? The New York Times and the Washington Post reported to the public that the arsenic found upon the 1991 exhumation of Taylor's body probably came from the embalming fluid. Now that's what they tried to convince the people of. Now was that a deception? Well, Taylor was not embalmed. His wife refused to allow it. So they just made up a story they thought people would believe. We must be very careful not to accuse doctors every time someone dies. However, the powerful class of assassins, Skull and Bones, carefully contemplate the medical part of their operation beforehand, as they expect to get away with the murder. It seems very interesting to me that a Skull and Bones chapter, the only one after Yale, was established at Tulane University Medical School in New Orleans, a city where the early presidential assassin group was formed with the financial aid of British spy Judah Benjamin, a Rothschild banking official. The deathbed confession clearly implicates doctors in all Skull and Bones actions. The death of Senator Huey Long points directly to Tulane officials. They have the financial and political power from high up to ruin the reputation of any doctor or any medical examiner, to have them brought up on charges, or to murder them even. For example, the problems faced by Thomas Noguchi. Noguchi was the LA medical examiner who proved beyond a shadow of doubt that the convicted killer, Sirhan Sirhan, was not near enough to have fired the shot that killed Senator Robert Kennedy, or the strange problems of the medical staff and doctors who did the official autopsy on JFK, having to rewrite the reports for somebody higher up complained about the way the report read, and the disappearance of his brain. Taylor had a 40-year military career in the United States Army. His enemy was the British bankers, even in the War of 1812. In the Black Hawk War and the Second Seminole War, his enemy, the Indian tribes, were financed, incited, and armed by the British. He also achieved fame, becoming a hero by leading American troops to victory in the Battle of Palo Alto and the Battle of Monterrey during the Mexican-American War. At the time, independent Mexico was still ruled by European royalty called monarchists, such as a brother of Franz Joseph, the Emperor of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. Spain is ruled by royalty and always has been, and they are against an elected government where there's no royalty involved, like the Republic, like our America. In 1810, Spanish people born in Mexico revolted against the Spanish rule with its plunder and dictatorship. Like the fiction character Zorro, Mexicans fought for and won their independence from Spain. Mexico became an independent empire, but was still ruled by the royal houses and the titles of nobility of Europe, because the people in Mexico were monarchists. They believed in the monarchy. So when Texas broke away from Mexico and General Zachary Taylor fought the Mexican-American War, he was actually fighting the ruthless and sinister European black nobility powerful banking cartel. The cabal's plan and method to destroy our free constitutional government of the people, for the people, and by the people was to divide and split the Union into two separate nations. The Europeans then would form a confederacy ruled by emperors such as Maximilian I. Maximilian, who after a distinguished career in the Austrian Navy, was proclaimed Emperor of Mexico on April 10, 1864. He was later, of course, disposed of. Maximilian invited ex-Confederates to move to Mexico in a series of settlements called the Carlotta Colony and the New Virginia Colony. This should be evidence that even if the South had won the Civil War, they would have been ruled and occupied by powerful European armies and the royalty. My point here is that Major General Taylor of the regular army, who served under the command of another assassinated president and general, William Henry Harrison, knew he was at war not with Mexico, but in fact with the European royal houses. The United States soon took expansive territory from them. That would include California, Nevada, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Colorado, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Oregon, and Washington, and plus we could include Texas, which freed itself. If Taylor had not been assassinated, their Confederacy plans would have been stopped cold. There would have been no Civil War and probably no Maximilian. We are taught that Lincoln was a Civil War president. But if you want the truth, take a close look at the 3 weak and degenerate presidents who held office between President Taylor and President Lincoln: Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, and James Buchanan. They performed in such a way that the slavery secession issue boiled up, got hotter and hotter, and divided the country, and finally got out of hand. 7 major states had seceded from the Union before Lincoln even took office. Taylor, who owned slaves himself, was strongly against the expansion of slavery into other states. At the beginning of his term, January 1850, congressional leaders offered a slavery bill called the Compromise of 1850. Taylor opposed the bill very strongly, mostly because he felt slavery must be forbidden in the new territories. President Zachary Taylor would unite the nation and stop slavery altogether. As secessionist threats multiplied, Taylor offered to personally lead troops against the secession efforts and said he would execute disunionists with less reluctance than I hang spies and deserters in Mexico. Get that again? Listen to that again. He would execute disunionists with less reluctance than I hang spies and deserters in Mexico. So as a general, he had hung spies and deserters. And he was going to do that to the people of the South, like Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee. And I think that would probably put an end to the idea of having a civil war. Civil War killed so many Americans, and people were killing their own cousins and family members. It's a terrible thing. It should never happen. The Compromise Bill seemed to be facing oblivion because of Taylor. The secession movement was too disunited in 1850 to form a viable threat of civil war. It maybe would have been totally killed and would have died out. Rather than be hanged by President Taylor, Southern leadership would have been forced to seek and to open alternative avenues, other than secession. Likely time itself would have resolved the slavery problem without a civil war. I believe this because Southern slaves in many cases had more benefits than the Northern workers in the factories. But within weeks, President Zachary Taylor, who would execute disunionists, he compared to Mexican European royalty spies, was dead and he had been murdered. Millard Fillmore, upon the assassination of Zachary Taylor, became the 13th President of the United States. He served for 4 years, from 1850 to 1853. The change in leadership also signaled an abrupt political shift. Fillmore had very different views on the slavery issue. The Compromise of 1850 lived again, and the secession promoters were no longer in fear of being hanged. They began to unify the South into an anti-Union Confederacy. The South had no chance of gaining anything with a civil war, because had they won, they would have been ruled by the European Emperor of Mexico, and the British, French, and Austrian troops would have occupied the cotton fields. President Millard Fillmore had been the first New York State Comptroller elected by general ballot, and was in office from 1848 to 1849. As Comptroller, he revised the New York's banking system. Fillmore was a banker's pawn. Fillmore would oppose the Abraham Lincoln administration later, and he would support President Andrew Johnson, who took office when Lincoln was assassinated, who was also a British pawn himself. President Johnson was controlled and dominated by Confederate General Mason, Ku Klux Klan, Golden Circle leader, and Luciferian Albert Pike, who Johnson pardoned from a long prison term for treason. Also, President Fillmore made a deal with the Emperor of Mexico, ending U.S. military operations there, and then also appointed Brigham Young to take over the Utah territory, causing the earlier pioneers in Utah to be run out of their homes and killed. President Millard Fillmore supported higher tariffs that would protect American businesses, but because of Machiavellian complexities of slavery, the tariffs were also harming the southern states, and no transition to a more stable economy for the South was provided for in the legislation. Now here's an interesting quote from Millard Fillmore. "May God save the country, for it is evident that the people will not." Maybe this president thought the European bankers would save the country. Britain was conquered by the Lombard bankers even before the Revolutionary War, and these bankers then attacked America with weapons of sedition, which they saw as the next great prize. America was their prize. They assassinated President Zachary Taylor to put their New York banker's pawn into the presidency. They feared Taylor would hang the secession promoters, who they were financing in the South and in New Orleans to split up the Union. Taylor knew who the enemy was because he had met them in the battlefield in Mexico, and he had defeated them. When an honest president tries to represent the people, he then becomes a danger to the agenda of the royal houses in Europe. He also becomes a danger to the invisible banking cartel. These ruthless dynasties, whose bloodline even includes the real Count Dracula, Von, do not hesitate for even a second to assassinate the President of the United States. Today, it is bailout of the bankers with billions and foreclose on the little guy's home. The simple solution is for the sovereign nation to adaptly issue its own paper money and not issue money that's borrowed then from the banks, because that creates the national debt. When the sovereign nation issues its own private money, there is no national debt and no danger of bankruptcy.